Ever wonder what it would be like to meet a version of yourself who leads a completely different life, yet shares so many of your quirks and dreams? Well, buckle up for a ride through a bizarre tale of birthdays, family, and an encounter that might just make you question everything you know about reality. This is the story of how, on one seemingly normal birthday, I met another me. Now, my family is a bit complicated. You could say we have a rocky history, a tangled web of old grudges, awkward traditions, and, well, some less than ideal personalities. But there was one thing that remained constant: birthdays. Every year, my family would drive up to see my grandmother. Not because we were particularly close, but because of her illness. She lived in a small red house perched on the cliffs overlooking the ocean, in a town called Chatterblinds, somewhere between Worcester and Brunswick, with a salty breeze always in the air. The house was small, a little creaky, but always impeccably clean, no matter how sick she was. The tradition wasn't about presents. My grandmother hated the idea of gifts, and our celebrations never went beyond a simple meal and reading from one of her books, accompanied by the haunting sound of her piano playing. Honestly, I didn't mind it. There was something comforting about the old house, her tired but dedicated presence, and the meals, even if they weren't extravagant. But what really kept me going on those birthday trips, especially as a kid, was the promise of presents for the road trip back home. My little reward for being good, for not making a fuss, and for enduring another round of weird grandma time. But there was one birthday that changed everything for me. A birthday I'll never forget, even though it was 100% outside the norm. I was 8 years old, and after dinner, when the grown-ups were busy with the usual chores, I snuck away to explore. Now, I wasn't exactly one for sitting still, and the coastline was the perfect place for a curious little kid to lose himself. As I walked along the edge of the cliffs, I found a small, hidden passageway between two massive rocks, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. My curiosity, as it always had, got the best of me, and I crawled through to see what lay beyond. What I found was nothing short of magical. A small cave tucked away in the rock, with blue flowers lining the tunnel. They looked too beautiful to resist, so I grabbed one to show my mom later. The cave opened up into a large, spherical chamber, and I stood in awe, gazing at the crystal-clear pool in the center. Water trickled from cracks in the stone walls, the light from above reflecting off the water in an almost ethereal way. But that wasn't the strangest part. No, as I looked up, I saw something I couldn't explain. There, in the ceiling, was water. Not like dripping moisture, but a perfect, still surface, almost like a mirror. And in that mirror, I saw my own reflection. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I waved, it waved back, I jumped, and it jumped. But then, I noticed something odd. My reflection wasn't holding the blue flower I'd found. When I looked closely, I realized the truth. It wasn't a reflection at all. It was another me, a version of myself from an alternate world, one that looked exactly like me, down to the last detail. Naturally, I had to talk to him. After all, what do you do when you meet another version of yourself? I asked him about his birthday, and he replied that he was at his grandmother's house too. That's when we realized we had a lot in common. We both hated the sheep stew, we were both stuck in this weird family tradition, and we were both wishing for something more out of life. But as the conversation continued, I learned there were differences between us too. For instance, his dad had a different name, and they lived in a different town. No blue flowers in his version of the cave either. Before I could even process all this, the sun began to set, and I knew I had to leave. But we made a pact, or rather, a small experiment. I climbed up the side of the cave, and so did the other me, mirroring my every movement. I handed him the blue flower, and it crossed from one world to the other. He promised to cherish it. Before I left, I called back to the other me, "Happy birthday, other me!" And he in turn shouted back, "Happy birthday, other me!" I didn't know it then, but those words would mark the beginning of a strange and fleeting connection I'd revisit year after year. Each birthday, I went back to that cave. We'd chat, share what had happened in our lives, and exchange birthday wishes. My life seemed to be on an upward trajectory, filled with hopeful dreams of new games or toys, while the other me wished for things I had taken for granted. His dad to get a job, a car, or one particularly chilling wish when I was 13, that the rain would stop burning his skin. But the connection began to unravel when I turned 14. That year, the other me didn't show up in the cave as usual. Instead, I found him dressed in black, telling me he had just come from his mom and grandmother's funeral. It hit me hard. The cheerful, slightly melancholic birthday exchanges we'd shared over the years had suddenly turned into something darker. But before I could fully process it, he was gone, leaving me alone in the cave, staring at the shimmering reflection in the ceiling. That was the last time I saw the other me. That year, my grandmother gave me a simple, beautiful silver cross for my 14th birthday. It was the only gift she ever gave me, and in many ways, it reminded me of the good things I had. I could only imagine what the other me had been through that year, and for the first time, I realized how lucky I was. But life moved on. My grandmother passed away, and the trips to Chatter Blinds ended. As the years passed, I grew older, and my wishes shifted. I no longer longed for a new video game or a cool airsoft rifle. Instead, I focused on career goals and adult responsibilities. But I kept that silver cross close, never forgetting that strange, magical time in the cave when I met another version of myself. Then, when I was 23, my mother passed away in a tragic accident. She had always wanted her ashes scattered at Chatter Blinds, beside her mother's grave. So, with her urn beside me, I made the long drive back to the coast, the same route I had taken so many times before. But the house was no longer there. Not really. My grandmother's home had fallen into ruin, taken over by nature. The once charming house was now a dilapidated wreck, consumed by the passage of time. It felt wrong to stay, but I had a mission to fulfill. I scattered my mother's ashes along the coast, just as she had wanted. And before I left, I couldn't resist. The curiosity of the cave still tugged at me. I ventured back to the cliffs, wondering if the cave would still be there. And when I found it, I stepped inside, half expecting to see the reflection in the ceiling again. But there was nothing. No other me. The cave was empty. Had I imagined it all? Was it just a fantasy of a child's imagination, or was it something more? I'll never know. All I know is that I'll always carry that silver cross with me, a reminder of the strange, magical birthday where I met another version of myself, and the fleeting connection we shared. And while I'll never see that cave again, or the other me, I'll always be grateful for that one incredible experience. So, if you've ever wondered what your life would look like in a parallel universe, or whether you might share a birthday with someone who's just like you, take a moment to think about the possibilities. You never know when you might meet your own other me. I walked along the rugged coastline, the cool, salty air mixing with the thick scent of overgrowth. The cliffs loomed high above, but my eyes were fixed ahead, on the familiar entrance of the cave I hadn't seen in years. Time had stretched, and I had grown in ways that made me wonder if I could still fit through the narrow opening. The thought flashed for only a moment, the fear of getting stuck. But as I pushed forward, the entrance widened, granting me passage. I emerged into the vast, spherical cavern. It looked much as I remembered. Familiar cracks in the walls, a pool of water resting in the middle, and above, the haunting floating reflection of another world. But today, something was different. I wasn't alone. There, standing by the rocky wall, was a figure that looked just like me, but something about him wasn't quite right. His hair was wild, untamed, and his clothing looked like a makeshift raincoat made from scraps, plastic rags hanging from his shoulders. The cave, his cave, was surrounded by clusters of blue flowers, large, almost sunflower-like, the same flowers I had gifted him when we first met all those years ago. It was the flowers that made everything real. "Hey, me," he greeted, his voice steady, though it had an edge to it, like he'd been waiting here for a long time. "Haven't seen you around." A shiver ran through me. "You're real?" I asked, stepping forward. "You're really real?" "As real as you," he grinned, eyes twinkling with a mixture of exhaustion and mirth. "For now, at least." I paused, trying to grasp the enormity of what was unfolding. I thought I was just making this up, that I was passing the time, playing. "We did that too," he said with a shrug. "But that doesn't make either of us any less real." His words struck me harder than I expected. This wasn't a dream, a hallucination. He was me. Or at least, he looked like me. I'd seen the reflection of a version of myself, one that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. He had been hiding in the cave for what seemed like months, sheltering from a world that had fallen apart. "It's bad out there," he explained. "Storms tear through the coast, and there's no telling when the raiders will show up on the main roads. The government? Collapsed. And there's something else. Something worse." He didn't seem to want to explain, but his words slipped out anyway. "People go missing at night, mostly during the storms. They talk about tall, dark figures dragging people into the woods." He stopped, his gaze dropping. "I haven't had a good night's sleep in months." I could feel my stomach twist as he spoke, the sadness, the loneliness, the desperation. It hit me like a punch to the gut. "I don't think I'm going to make it," he admitted, voice breaking. "It's just a matter of time." His words hung in the air. The unfairness of it all gnawed at me. Here I was, standing in a cave with a version of myself that had suffered, that had fought to survive in a world that had shattered, while I, despite my own hardships, had been lucky. It felt wrong, and somehow that feeling ignited something inside me. I couldn't leave him here. Not like this. "I'll get you out of here," I said, climbing up the rock wall with purpose. "Come on, we'll make it." The climb was more difficult than I remembered, but I finally reached the top and extended my hand to him. He reached back, our fingers brushing against each other's, and for a moment, we both hung there, suspended in midair. We slipped. It was as if time itself hesitated. But as strange as it was, I was just a bit heavier. My weight, perhaps my diet, my clothes, or the life I'd lived, pulled us through. And in that moment, I dragged him from his world and into mine. We fell into the pool, a splash of cold water that sent a sharp pain through my tailbone. It was a small price to pay, though, because when I looked at his face, I saw something I hadn't expected: relief. "I'll consider this a belated birthday present," he said with a grin. "Thanks, other me." I smiled, wiping the sweat from my forehead. "You're welcome, other me." As we left the cave together, a strange, lingering feeling settled over me. Two versions of the same person. How could that be possible? How could I stand here with someone who was, well, me, but from another life? Before I could fully process it, he broke the silence with laughter. Laughter that rang out like a child who had just been told the most incredible joke. It was a laugh that was too genuine, too full of joy. "What's so funny?" I asked, bewildered. "It doesn't hurt," he said between fits of laughter. "It doesn't hurt at all." And in that,